found them. I found all the people that were on Katie's boat, y'all. Shout out to the real Jada J that turned me on to this picture. And as y'all can see, we've got a match with the necklace and the swimsuit. Think I busted out my glasses and red lipstick just for the swimsuit? Nah. Now, as I talked about yesterday, we've all suspected that this is Kendall for a while now. The identity of this curly-haired girl has always eluded us. Well, not anymore, folks. For now, I'm gonna just refer to these girls as T and L. As you can see, L clearly has the same kind of hair texture that's in the bottom of this picture. We know that these two were together on 4th of July, and T did not one, but 2 Nolan tributes after his body was found. Now, another one of their friends had a reel, which they did a little panning video on the best 4th of July ever. And who was in that video? Well, that looks to me to be Jacob, Kendall's longtime boyfriend. So it seems confirmation to me that both Kendall and her boyfriend were on this boat the entire day. Now that I have found this group of friends, I was scouring the pictures and I found this. We've got Elle with somebody I immediately recognized because I remembered that swimsuit, and they tried to hide this picture in a document dump so you didn't know what day it was. Well, if it isn't Nevaeh.
Uh-oh. What do we have here, y'all? What do we owe? That's Nolan right there, y'all. That's Nolan right there. I'm trying to do it slow for y'all. This one of them breeze by. You know how they do the little boomerang thing on Instagram and all. It's one of those. Y'all see that? So I want y'all to pay attention to see everybody. I'm gonna see who that is in the front. Y'all see this? That's Nolan. That is Nolan. I'm trying to see who it. So you got all these damn people ain't saying nothing. This is wild. 1, 2, 3. There's somebody right here in the cut. There's somebody right here. Somebody right here. 1, 2, 3, 4. And there's somebody at the front of the driver. 5, 6, 7. Justice for Nolan, man. Let's get it, y'all. Look, 2 right there. Hold on. 2 up there. Look, 2 up there. Just enjoying the breeze and shit. That's sad, man.
What if the biggest problem in the Nolan Wells investigation isn't what we know, but what the timeline still can't explain? Because new photographs and videos are raising questions about who was actually on the boats that day, who was with Nolan, and perhaps most importantly, where Nolan was during a critical window on July 4th.
Photos of Katie, Nolan Wells' friend, are legitimate, then the timeline has blown up. I'm going to show you guys a few photos that allegedly Katie had posted on her Snap, and take a look at the timestamps, and you let me know who you notice is missing at this time. Just so you can see, 5:24 p.m., July 4th, 5:24 p.m. We don't see Nolan. Here, we see July 4th at 5:44 p.m. Allegedly Katie, tattoos do match, no Nolan. Now we have 5:35 p.m. Katie, tattoos match. Here's the time right here at the very bottom, the 4th of July. No Nolan. Last and certainly not least, 6:02 p.m. July 4th, 6:02 p.m. No Nolan. Why is this important? This was important because the timeline was that he was left around 4:30 in the afternoon on the island with Katie and her friends. But we just saw a handful of photos with timestamps, and we don't see Nolan anywhere. And we already know that the friends were already long gone at this point. So now it brings into question, where was Nolan?
And now, there appears to be another problem. Several images reportedly taken later that afternoon appear to show Nolan's friends together, but Nolan is nowhere to be seen. That matters because the timeline we've repeatedly heard suggested that Nolan was left on Horn Island sometime around the late afternoon hours before his friends returned toward shore. If that timeline is accurate, then these photographs could potentially help establish what happened next. But first, let's step back. Because there are several pieces of this story that need to be separated. There are photographs. There are social media posts. There are statements attributed to people involved. There are recorded emergency communications. There are subpoenas seeking additional records. And then there are questions that remain unanswered. One of the most interesting developments involves photographs appearing to show a large group of people aboard a boat on July 4th. People who have been following this case have been trying to identify everyone in those images. Some individuals appear to match people who were already known to have been part of the wider friend group. Others are less certain, and that distinction is important. Identifying someone from a photograph is not the same thing as proving where that person was for the entire day. But when multiple photographs, clothing, accessories, hairstyles, social media connections, and other images appear to line up, investigators and the public naturally want to know whether these are the same people. And if they are, another question follows. What exactly was this group doing, and when? Some of the images reportedly show people on the water relatively late in the day. That creates an obvious timeline question. Were people dropped off earlier and then picked up again? Did multiple boats move between locations? Did some people switch boats? Or are we simply looking at different moments that have been interpreted as one continuous sequence? Right now, those questions remain unresolved. And that's why the photographs are potentially important, but they should be treated as pieces of evidence to be verified, not as automatic proof of what happened. Now, let's talk about Nolan. According to accounts discussed publicly, Nolan was expected to have traveled toward Horn Island with friends. But other photographs and videos have surfaced that appear to place Nolan with a larger group around the time they were preparing to leave. That creates a conflict that deserves clarification. If Nolan was already with one group preparing to travel, what happened immediately afterward? Who was actually on each boat? Who left from which dock? Who arrived at Horn Island? And who was still there later? These are not minor details. They are the building blocks of the timeline. And the timeline is everything in a missing person investigation. Then there is another issue. One photograph appears to show a large group of people getting onto a boat, yet Warren Hudson does not appear to be visible in the image. Again, that does not prove Warren wasn't there. Someone could have been inside the boat, outside the frame, or simply absent when the photograph was taken. But it does raise a reasonable question. If this photograph captures the group preparing to leave, where was everyone else? And was this actually the boat that Nolan traveled on? Those questions become even more important because different public accounts have described the boating activity that day in different ways. At one point, the public was told about multiple boats and a relatively large group of people spread across them. So instead of asking only who was on the boat, we need to ask which boat, at what time, leaving from where, going where, and who was on it at that specific moment, because those distinctions can completely change a timeline. Now we come to perhaps one of the most significant developments, the emergency call involving sea tow, or STO. We've heard audio from what appears to be an emergency involving a boat experiencing problems. The person communicating with dispatch sounds concerned about the situation and asks for assistance. But questions have been raised about what happened afterward. There have been reports that a parent or grandparent may have communicated that emergency assistance was no longer needed. That claim needs to be independently confirmed. But if such a call did occur, it raises an obvious question. What happened between the initial emergency request and the decision to cancel or withdraw that request? Who made that call? Who received it? What exactly were they told? And was the person making the original emergency call aware that assistance had allegedly been canceled? Those questions matter because the original recording could potentially establish a much more precise sequence of events. And that is exactly why Nolan's mother has reportedly sought the original recordings and related dispatch information through subpoenas involving STO Services International and Ward Marine Services, which operates as STO South Mississippi. The request reportedly goes beyond simply asking for an audio file. It seeks information that could help establish how the call was received, how it was dispatched, what procedures were followed, and what happened during the response. That could become important because an original recording can potentially answer questions that edited clips or social media reposts cannot. But there is another issue here. There have also been questions about previous subpoenas involving social media information. The public has heard about requests for records from social media platforms, but there has not been a complete public accounting of what those platforms ultimately produced, what they objected to, or what investigators were able to obtain. And until those records are made available, or investigators explain what they found, we simply don't know. The same applies to Nolan's phone. There have been numerous public discussions about the phone, its location data, messages, and what may or may not have been deleted. But speculation surrounding digital evidence is not the same as verified forensic findings. The phone needs to be examined. The records need to be authenticated. And the timeline needs to be reconstructed from evidence rather than social media theories. Now, there's another major issue that has generated public debate: potential conflicts of interest. Questions have been raised publicly about relationships between people connected to the investigation and local officials or members of the community. Those questions include whether elected officials or other decision-makers have personal or professional relationships with families connected to people who may have information relevant to the case. But here's the important distinction. A relationship does not automatically prove corruption. A friendship does not automatically prove a cover-up. And knowing someone's family does not automatically mean an official cannot participate in an investigation. What matters is whether those relationships create an actual conflict under the applicable rules, and whether the appropriate officials have taken steps to address that conflict. That is something that should be determined through documented facts, not assumptions. And this is where transparency becomes incredibly important. If officials have no conflict, explain why. If they do have a conflict, explain what safeguards are being used. If someone should recuse themselves, explain the process. The public should not have to fill in those blanks with speculation. Now let's move to another controversy that has received considerable attention online. There have been public interviews involving attorneys representing some of the young men connected to the case. One interview generated particular discussion after a commentator claimed that the young men had taken polygraph examinations. That claim was subsequently challenged publicly by one of their attorneys, who said his clients had not taken polygraph tests. That's a significant distinction, because whether someone did or did not take a polygraph is a factual question. It shouldn't be left to competing statements on podcasts and social media. There has also been criticism surrounding business relationships and promotional appearances involving people connected to the commentary surrounding the case. Some observers have suggested that these relationships create a conflict of interest. Again, that allegation should be handled carefully. A business relationship does not, by itself, establish that anyone acted improperly in the Nolan Wells investigation, but it can create legitimate questions about transparency. And whenever someone is simultaneously commenting publicly on a case, defending people connected to that case, and promoting a product or business relationship involving one of those people, viewers have a reasonable interest in understanding the relationship. Transparency is the key. Now, another claim has surfaced that is even more serious. A message reportedly sent to a commentator described an alleged sequence in which Nolan was supposedly on the island with a girl, later returned to friends, and then became involved in an altercation after his phone was allegedly taken. The message goes on to make claims about Nolan struggling to breathe and coughing up blood, and suggests that his body may have been moved later. Those are extremely serious allegations. But at this point, they must remain allegations. A message sent to a social media account is not the same thing as verified eyewitness testimony, and an anonymous or unverified account should never be treated as established fact. If investigators can identify the source and corroborate the information with phone records, witness statements, surveillance, forensic evidence, or other documentation, then its significance could change dramatically. Until then, it is simply an allegation that requires verification. And that brings us back to the photographs. Because the newest images may be far more useful than speculation if they can be authenticated. Several photographs reportedly attributed to Katie appear to have timestamps from the afternoon of July 4th. One is around 5:24 p.m. Another appears around 5:35 p.m. Another around 5:44 p.m. and another around 6:02 p.m. And according to the images being circulated, Nolan does not appear in those photographs. That is important because of the previously discussed timeline suggesting Nolan was with Katie and others earlier that afternoon. If Nolan was supposedly with that group at that point, why isn't he visible? There are several possible explanations. He could have been somewhere outside the camera's frame. He could have left the group. The photographs could have been taken at different locations. The timestamps could require verification. Or the earlier timeline could simply be incomplete. But there is another possibility that investigators would need to examine. What if Nolan was already somewhere else by this point? That's why these photographs matter. Not because they automatically tell us where Nolan was, but because they may help eliminate certain versions of the timeline. And that's the bigger issue in this case. We're hearing multiple versions of what happened. We're seeing photographs that appear to raise new questions. We're hearing audio that may provide another piece of the sequence. We're seeing legal filings and subpoenas seeking additional evidence. But the public still does not have a complete, independently verified timeline from the beginning of the day to the moment Nolan disappeared. And until that timeline is established, almost every new photograph creates another question. So perhaps the most important question right now isn't simply, what happened to Nolan Wells? It is, can investigators establish exactly where every key person was, and on which boat, during every critical part of July 4? Because if that can be established, some of these contradictions may disappear. And if they can't, then those gaps deserve answers. The goal should not be to decide guilt through social media. It should not be to convict anyone in the court of public opinion. And it should not be to turn an unverified allegation into a fact. The goal is much simpler. Find Nolan's complete timeline. Determine what happened. Identify what evidence supports each part of that timeline. And if someone committed a crime, let the evidence and the justice system determine what happens next. For now, the photographs raise questions. The emergency communications raise questions. The boat movements raise questions. The conflicting accounts raise questions. And the 5:24 to 6:02 p.m. window may be one of the most important pieces of that puzzle. Because if Nolan was supposed to be with this group during that period, investigators need to establish exactly where he was. And if he wasn't with them anymore, then the next question becomes even more important. Where did he go? That's the question that the evidence, not speculation, needs to answer.